This conference will now be recorded.
Before I start, let me ask one question. We have these commands: kubectl apply, kubectl create, kubectl update, kubectl delete, right? So I can apply file something like this, your manifest file. I can apply, either I can create or I can update or I can delete. So I can use create or update. What is this apply? What is the difference between apply and create? Sometimes in the interview they are going to ask this question. What is difference between apply and create? So apply is like, it works like create or update, right? It is not imperative declarative. It is not like that. It's like, it works like create or update. What does it mean? If that the Kubernetes resource doesn't exist, what it does? If it is not exist already, it doesn't exist. If it doesn't exist, what it does? It will create. If it is already exist, if it already exists, what it does? If it is already exist, what it does? Is it going to check whether it is updated or not, whether it is correct or not? If there are any changes, if it is already exist, if there are some changes, it will update. If it is already exist, it will update. Now create, if I directly use create, what it does? It will create if not exist. If it exists, is it going to throw error? It will say, or it will throw error saying that object already exists. If I use create, it will create if it is not exist. If it exists, it will throw error saying that object already exists. Then if I want to do any updates, I have to do using this update. Instead of using create or update separately, can I directly go for apply, so that either it will create if it is not there, if it is there it will update. So that's why wherever you see most widely, which one you see? Well, if you are already working also, you don't see like kubectl create or update. Most of the cases you will see kubectl apply only. If I want to delete the resources, whatever has been created using that manifest, can I use this option kubectl delete -f? So whatever objects has been defined in this manifest, is it going to be deleted if I execute like this? Yes. So is everyone clear now? What is this kubectl apply create, difference between apply and create? Okay. So this is how it is. Okay. Now let's come back to our actual concept. So far, how we scaled these resources? We created a RC, we created a RS, we created a deployment. We can scale up, scale down these resources, right? How did we deploy it so far? Manual deployment, sorry, manual scaling. We're trying to scale manually. I don't want to scale manually. Is it possible for me to scale up, scale down based on the CPU or based on the memory, based on the resource utilization on those spots? Yes. So Here we have one concept called pod autoscaler. Pod autoscaler. When it comes to auto scaling or scaling, first of all, whether it's a server scaling, whatever it is, forget how many types of scalings we can do. One is vertical, another one is horizontal. So we have already done the scaling in AWS. In AWS, using auto scaling, using those scaling policies, what we have scaled in AWS also, there is a auto scaling concept, auto scaling groups. So what we have scaled in auto scaling group using AWS auto scaling, what we have scaled, guys? We have scaled the servers, we have scaled the instances. So what type of scaling AWS ASG supports? ASG, AWS auto scaling group, is supporting which one? Horizontal scaling, right? Now, what is horizontal, what is vertical? I think I already explained in AWS also, if I am not wrong. So what is vertical, what is horizontal, guys? Increasing the capacity, increasing the capacity is called increasing the resources. Increasing the resources, increasing the capacity is called as vertical. Horizontal is kind of a replicating. Horizontal is kind of a replicating. We are duplicating that instance, replicating that instance. Instead of increasing the capacity, with same capacity, we are replicating another instance, right? So similarly in Kubernetes also, we have a auto scaling. But what Kubernetes does, is it going to scale your servers? Is it going to scale your servers? Is it going to scale your infrastructure? No. Kubernetes is not managing your infrastructure. Within a given infrastructure, what we can scale within the given nodes, what we can scale, what this pod autoscaler can scale. Does this pod autoscaler can increase and decrease the nodes, the servers in your cluster? No. So what we can scale? Kubernetes is managing what? Is Kubernetes is managing your infrastructure, or is Kubernetes is managing the pods in the given infrastructure? Kubernetes is managing the pods in a given infrastructure. So using this pod autoscaler, we can scale the pods. We can scale the pods. Here we have a HPA, which is widely used. What is this HPA stands for? Horizontal pod auto scaler. Horizontal pod auto scaler. So it supports this one also, but no one will use this one. No one will use this one. What is this? VPA stands for vertical pod autoscaler. Vertical pod autoscaler. But whether it's a server, whether it's a pod, widely used scaling is what? This one. Horizontal. Horizontal. Now we can auto scale our pods either vertically or horizontally, right? But based on what? Based on what? We can scale pods based on the resource utilization of the pods. What is resources here? What is resources here? The resource utilization is basically what is resources here? It is memory and it's is your CPU. So whenever there is a lot of load, on your application, does CPU and memory utilization will go high? If lot of people started accessing your application, either memory utilization or either CPU utilization will go high. If lot of people are accessing your application, is the CPU utilization, memory utilization goes high? Yes. If you don't take any action, if you don't take any action, if your pod, let's say pod, if your pod is running out of CPU, your process, basically within a pod you have a container. So if your container is running out of CPU, what will happen? If your container is running out of memory, container is nothing but a process. If that process is running out of CPU, if that process is running out of memory, what will happen? If it is running out of CPU, what happens? Any process that can be, forget about container or server. If the process is running out of CPU, what happens? If the process is running out of memory, what happens? These are questions in the interview also sometimes. If it is running out of CPU, your process may not crash. Your process may not crash, but will it hung? Is your process is going to be hung, which means will it reduce your performance? Is it going to reduce that performance of that process? Whatever application, whatever logic is running, will the performance of that application, will it become slow? Yes. If it is running out of memory, if the process is running out of memory, what happens? Basically, your process will be killed. Your process might be crashed. It could crash. So if there is a lot of load on my application, how to handle these things? I don't want my performance to be impacted. My application performance should not be degraded. I don't want my application performance to be degraded. And also I don't want my process to be killed whenever there is a load. What is the solution? Can I scale? Can I scale that process, that application? In Kubernetes, our applications are running as pods. Can I scale my pods so that the load will be distributed? Instead of having 2 pods, if service has four pods, does the load will be distributed? Suppose if I scale, instead of 2 pods, let's say I have scaled it to 4, the service will distribute the load between those 4 replicas, 4 pods. I can scale. So I don't want to scale manually, or at any point of time I don't want to have, at all the time I don't I don't want to have 4 pods or 8 pods like that. Whenever there is a load, it has to increase the pods and it has to decrease the pods. Then can I go for this pod auto scaler? Based on the load, it will adjust the number of replicas of your replica set or deployment or replication controller. Yes. What is vertical pod auto scaling? We are not going to do vertical. What is vertical auto scaling? Instead of scaling the pod, we can change the capacity of the pod. We can increase the capacity of we can increase the resources for your container, your pod, but that no one will use. This is widely used. Now, in real time, we are going to set the resources also for our pods, right? As of now, am I setting any resource capacity, resource limits for my pods, whatever has been deployed? As of now, whatever pods, whatever containers we have created, did I set any limit, how much memory minimum that is required and how much memory maximum that container, that pod can take? Did we set any resource requests or limits for our containers, our pods so far? If you see, whatever pods we deployed, let me connect to my Ansible, sorry, let me connect to my Kubernetes machine. One second, let me log in. So far we deployed lot of pods, lot of applications. Either it can be a deployment. If you see, are we setting any resources? Are we setting any resources, resource requests and limits for our containers, which I am trying to schedule in my Kubernetes cluster? No. Sneha is saying yes. Where did I set? Where did I set resources for my container? I mean to say how much CPU, how much memory that container can take. That so we didn't. But in real time, is it recommended to deploy your containers, your applications without defining resource requests and limits? In real time, is it recommended to deploy your applications without defining your resource requests and limits? It is not recommended. We need to define. We need to set the limits. Why we need to set the limits? If I don't set the limits for this one, all the pods are running in this cluster. The resources are common for all these pods. So if this container takes more CPU, more memory, does other applications will run out of CPU and memory? If you don't set limits, it can take lot of CPU, lot of memory. Other application may run out of CPU and memory. If there is some code, some junk code has been written by some developers, it is not, it is taking lot of CPU, lot of memory, one application, it is going to impact other application. So that's why in real time, we are going to set the resources for our pods, our containers. We have a resource requests and we have a resource limits. So based on those resource limits, based on the resource limits which I have been set to my pods, can I scale my pods automatically? If I set the limit for my pods, saying that it can take 1 GB RAM, 1 core CPU. So based on that limit, if it is already reaching 80% of the load, 90% of the load, can I scale my pods automatically based on this auto scaler, based on the current resource utilization in that pod, in that container? If I don't set the limit, I cannot measure. I cannot measure what is the current load. So if I go for a pod auto scaler, I can measure what is the current utilization, current memory utilization, CPU utilization of that pods container. If it is already reached 80%, I can increase and decrease. Now, in real time, it is recommended to set the resource limits and request for multiple purposes so that the container cannot take more than that. Suppose if I create a pod and within that pod I have this container. If I set resources, like this, we call it as a resource requests and limits. Requests and limits, very, very important interview question also. CPU, memory, CPU, memory. So sometimes in the interview, they will ask what is resource request and limits in Kubernetes. What is resource request and limits in Kubernetes? Using this resource request and limits, we can set the resources for that pod. How much resources minimum we are trying to allocate for that one, maximum how much it can utilize. So if I say resource request, I'm saying 256, let's say something like this, 256 MI, 0.5, which means half core CPU. So if I have something like this in my pod manifest, I'm requesting my Kubernetes API server, like this. So does the scheduler, first request goes to API server will validate that request, and the scheduler, is it going to see, is there any node which has at least this much memory available, this much CPU available to schedule this pod? The scheduler, if I have something like this, the scheduler will check, do I have any node with this much memory is still available, this much CPU is available, then the pod will be scheduled to that node. Which means if I define a resource request like this, do I get a guarantee that my pod will be scheduled, my pod will get minimum this much memory, this much CPU? Minimum, this request is minimum. Do I get a guarantee that if my pod is scheduled, which means this much CPU and this much memory is available for that pod, that is reserved for that pod container? That is minimum guarantee resources you are going to get if you have like this. Suppose if I don't have any node with this much CPU, this much memory available, then pod will be scheduled? If I don't have any node with this much CPU, this much memory available, does pod will be scheduled? Or it will go to pending state? It will go to pending state, which means will I get a minimum this much CPU, this much memory if my pod is scheduled? Which means does my pod, that container will have this much CPU, this much memory allocated or reserved basically for that if it is scheduled? Yes. Now what is this limits? This is minimum. What is this limits? If I say limit like this, how much maximum it can utilize? Now even though this server has maybe some memory available, some CPU available, if I set the limits, even though there is a lot of load on this application, if I set the limit like this, is it going to take beyond this memory, beyond this CPUs? Even though this node has available memory, is it going to go beyond these limits? Whenever there is a load, will it go beyond this? No, that is what the meaning of limit. That is what the meaning of limit, maximum. Maximum, I am allocating this much only. You cannot go beyond that much. So using resource request and limits, what we can define, guys? Using resource request and limits, can we set the resources like CPU and memory, how much minimum you are requesting for your pod and how much maximum it can go? We can set the resource limits and request. Now, if I set like this, if there is a lot of load on this one, suppose if I set limit as 1 GB and 1 core, if there is a lot of load on this pod, let's say I have two pods with the, I have two pods, I have set the limit as this much. There is a service. If lot of people are accessing, lot of requests is coming to that service will distribute the traffic. That service will distribute the traffic. Let's say lot of requests are coming. There is a lot of load. So does slowly, based on the load, does slowly that CPU and memory utilization will be spiked? Will it be increased based on the load on this one and this one? Slowly, does the load will be, if the load is increased, when there is a lot of load, the CPU utilization, memory utilization will be increased. But will it able to go beyond this much? Even though there is a lot of load, will it able to go beyond this much? No. Then what action I can take? What action I can take so that I will not have an impact? We need to scale. We need to replicate. We need to scale. There are two types of scaling. One is horizontal, another one is vertical. Horizontal in the sense, can I increase the limit? Horizontal in the sense, instead of 1 GB, I can increase to 2 GB. Horizontal, the capacity. But no one is going to do this one. So instead of horizontal, we are going to do it vertical. Vertical in the sense replicating, duplicating that pod. So instead of two pods, I can bring another pod. So if I have a 3 more pods, will the load will be shared to this one also? Will the load will be shared to this one so that the utilization may come down here in this server, because now we have a total 3 pods. Now we scaled, but what type of scaling we have done so far? Manual scaling. We have not done any vertical scaling, Prashant. Okay, so we have done only manual scaling, but I don't want to do manual. I am not sure when the load will come, when the load will be not there. I don't want to do manually. I want to scale my pods automatically. So that is where what we can use, what concept we can use. There is a concept called HPA, horizontal pod autoscaler. We are not going to use this one, vertical, no one will use. So using horizontal pod autoscaler, what we can do? We can adjust the number of pod replicas of a RC or RS or deployment based on observed CPU or memory utilization. Based on the observed CPU or memory utilization, we can adjust the number of pod replicas automatically. Instead of we change the replica number of a RC or RS or deployment, who will change that replica number in the background programmatically? If I use HPA, if I use HPA, instead of I change the replica number, manually of a deployment, that will be done in the background by this controller, basically this HPA, horizontal pod autoscaler. Now, if I want to do horizontal pod autoscaler, do I need a matrix? Do I need a data about that pods? What is the current CPU utilization? What is the current memory utilization? Do I need that information to take the decision? Does HPA requires that metrics to take the decision when to scale? Do we need metrics? Do we need data? Basically, metrics in the sense data. Does this HPA requires the data? What is the current CPU utilization? What is the current memory utilization? Without that, can I set the threshold? We need to set the threshold. We need to set the threshold value. What is the meaning of threshold value? Suppose the CPU utilization is 80%, or memory utilization is 80%. The threshold values to take the decision. So we need that data. We need that data. For your HPA to take the decision, you need to have the data. As of now, we don't have any add-on or any application or any software which is gathering that metrics. If you remember, in Docker, what command we used? What command we used to see the CPU and memory utilization of our container? What command we used? Netstat. What is that netstat? What command we used? Docker command to see the information about that container, how much CPU, how much memory. That is Docker stat. Docker stat, not top. In the Docker. So the Docker stats was showing the CPU utilization and memory utilization. Now, in Kubernetes, we can see that CPU and memory utilization of your pods using one command called kubectl top nodes top pods. But by default, this is not going to work. By default, this is not going to work. We need to have some application hosted in the cluster so that it can gather the information about your pods, how much CPU utilization, how much memory utilization on the nodes or on the pods. If you see, by default, is it working? Do we have any metrics? Metrics. There is no metrics API available to get the data. So if I want to scale, if I want to do this HPA, do I need to have those metrics? Without having those metrics, does this HPA can take the decision? Because that HPA needs that information. What is the current CPU utilization? What is the current memory utilization on your pod on which you are trying to scale automatically? So we need that information. Without having those metrics, will I able to do HPA? Will I able to scale automatically without having those metrics? No. So we need to have a metric server installed. Sometimes in the interview, they are going to ask, what is metrics server? What is metric server? So earlier, we used to have a heapster. in earlier in initial releases of Kubernetes, in initial releases of Kubernetes, we used to have heapster by default in Kubernetes. This heapster also used to get those information only, but it is heavyweight. It is heavyweight. It requires lot of CPU, lot of memory. So what they have done, they have removed this heapster. They introduced metric server, very lightweight application, which is gathering the metrics. But this is not going to be available by default. This is not going to be available by default. We need to install this metric server. So do I have any metric server related pods running in my Kubernetes cluster? As of now, in any namespace, if you see, do you have any metric server related pods running? Whether it's a kube system namespace or any other namespace? No. So first we need to have that metric server. First we need to have the metric server. Okay. So let me open the document. So we need to have a metric server, right? As I already discussed, HPA, it's a automatically scale the number of pods of a replication controller deployment replica set based on the observed CPU and memory utilization. So HPA, does HPA requires metrics? Does HPA requires metrics to take the decision? So this HPA requires metrics to take the decision. So HPA will internally interact with, or it will internally use metric server APIs to identify the CPU and memory utilization of your pods. So we need to have a metric server. What is metric server basically? It is one application. What it does? What it does? What that metric server does? Basically, it will collect the metrics. Metrics is nothing but some data. Metrics is nothing but a data, collection of data. That can be any data. So this metric server is going to collect the metrics. Metrics are nothing but, the data is nothing but like CPU, memory utilization of your pod, CPU utilization of your pod, right? Or node, it is going to gather. So do I have a metric server by default coming in Kubernetes? The way I am getting this API server control manager scheduler, by default, do we have those metric server running by default? No. So we can deploy that as a add-on, metric server. If you see in the official documentation itself, right? Metric server, Kubernetes metric server. So we can measure the CPU and memory utilization of your nodes, pods by using this metric server. So this metric server is going to gather the information. By default, this is not deployed. If you want to deploy, can I deploy using one YML file? In EKS also, you will not have this metric server by default. You need to deploy based on your requirement. So now, this metric server, I can deploy using this deployment file. I can deploy using this deployment file. So they have given one GitHub, Kubernetes official website, right? So I can deploy using that YML file. I can execute some command like this. What this YML contains? Let me open this YML. If you see, if you see, is it creating required Kubernetes resources to deploy? If you see, is it creating a deployment? In which namespace it is creating the deployment? I can use this YML. I can just apply this YML so that metric server will be deployed. What object is getting created? Deployment. In which namespace it is getting created? In which namespace it is going to be created? If I apply this file, cube system, using this image. If you see, is it our own image? Is it our application image? Do we need to create this image? No. So who created this image? In which registry this image is there? If you see this image, metric server image, in which registry it is there? It is there in the Kubernetes GCR. It is there in the Kubernetes GCR registry. Now, so I can deploy this metric server. And along with this deployment, what other object is getting created? If you see, what other object is getting created? Service of which type? The type is not defined by default. So what type of service will be created for this metric server? But what is the default service type, guys? What is the default service type? The cluster IP. Now, sir, along with this, I see something else. What is all these things? I see some service account. I see some cluster role, cluster roles, role bindings. What is this basically? This is basically permissions for that application, that metric server, what it can do in a Kubernetes. So metric server is need to talk to the Kubernetes API, Kubernetes APIs. So without giving a permissions for that application, will it able to get how many nodes are there in the cluster, how many pods are there in the cluster? That metric server will talk to the APIs. Without having the permissions, does that application will be able to access anything in the cluster? No. So this application is internal application. This requires to talk to the Kubernetes APIs. Now, if you see, there is a service account which is getting created, and we are creating some role. If you see, are we giving a permissions to pods and nodes? What type of permissions we are giving? It is like in AWS, we are giving a AWS permissions using IAM, right? In AWS, how you are managing access to the AWS resources? In AWS, how you are managing access to the AWS resources like EC2, EBS, ELB, VPC? How you are giving a permissions to the AWS resources in AWS? Did we use one concept called IAM? IAM, right? Similarly, in Kubernetes, we can manage the permissions to the Kubernetes resources. We can manage permissions to the Kubernetes resources using one concept called RBAC. What is that RBAC? As I already told, role-based access control. So here it's all about roles, role bindings, all these things. We will discuss this in a separate class, but I don't want you to confuse what is this. Okay. So we are creating a role. We are linking this role. We are linking this role with this service account, and we are using that service account. They are using that service account for this pod. If you see, they are attaching that service account. It is like in your AWS, you are creating one IAM role and you are attaching policies to that IAM role, and you are attaching that IAM role to your server. So does the server get the permissions to the AWS resources based on the policies you attached in AWS? Yes. Similarly, here we are creating one service account. We are creating one role. We are attaching this role to this service account, and that service account has been used in this application, in this deployment, something like this. So in this case, does this metric server will make a API calls? Does this metric server can able to make a API calls to Kubernetes APIs to get how many nodes are there, how many pods are there? Because the permissions has been granted, right? So that is what happening in this file. That is what happening in this file. Okay. Now I can deploy like this directly. I can deploy like this. So this is manifest file. Does this manifest file lot of Kubernetes resources, deployment, service account, all those stuff? So it will be created. Now, for better understanding of our students, I have one separate GitHub repository in our own GitHub, Mithun Technologies DevOps. Metrics server, this one, in our own GitHub repository, Mithun Technologies DevOps. So here I have explained what is metric server, and I am maintaining that files only, here only, same, right? Those files are part of this folder. So if you see, same file, but I split it into multiple files. Deployment in one YML, that metric server deployment in one YML, the service in one YML, the roles and other stuff in another YML, like this. Now you guys can use this also to deploy. You can follow these instructions and apply. Now I'm just downloading that files from GitHub to the server where I have a kubectl installed. I'm going to clone those files into the server where I have a kubectl installed. Now here, let me clone that folder. Basically that folder has those files, all those files, deployment for your metric server, service account for your metric server, all those files. So I have cloned that one. Now let me go inside that metric server folder. Let me cd to that metric server folder. Then here I have lot of folders. My Kubernetes version is greater than 1.8 plus. So I'm going to apply all the files which is there in that directory. kubectl apply -f. Just I'm giving a folder name. Within this folder, I have lot of Kubernetes YMLs. Will all the YMLs will be applied? Will all the objects will be created if I apply like this? If I execute like this, if you see, is it created all those things? Deployment, service account, role binding, everything. Now let me come back. This time, if you see, is metric server is running in kube system namespace now? Do I have one pod, metric server pod? It is scheduled. It is trying to come up. This metric server pod in your kube system namespace. That container is yet to come up. Now the metric server pod is up and running. Now will this command work? Since we have a metric server enabled, after some time it is going to fetch the data. This time, do you see, is it able to gather the metrics? As of now, I don't have any pods in the default namespace. That's why it is not saying anything. Let's say, now, can I see node level? Node level. Can I see what is the CPU utilization? What is the memory utilization as of now in my nodes at node level, and also pod level? Can I see how much CPU utilization, how much memory utilization is there in each pod? This metric server. Now, since I have a metric server, can I have HPA for any deployment, any replica set or any replication controller? Can I create a HPA so that based on the load, it can increase and decrease the number of replicas? Based on the load, it can increase and decrease the number of replicas, right? Now, let me take one sample application, one demo application. I'm taking one sample application, one demo application. So I'm using one sample application. Whether it's a sample application, whether it's an actual application, does this HPA concept will change? Again, whether it's some sample application, whether it is your actual deployment in real time, does this HPA concept will change? No, right? Now, I'm taking one sample application. I'm using this image. If you see, what is this here? What I'm trying to do here for this container? What is this? So far, we have not used this block. What is this? What we are trying to do here? We are setting the resource requests and limits. We are setting resource request and limits for that container. So you may have a question, sir, how can I decide these numbers in real time? Can I blankly give some values? In real time, this resource requests and limits is based on what? How can I decide these numbers in real time? Based on the application, what type of application you are running, minimum how much CPU, how much memory it is required, based on what type of application you are trying to run here, right? So for running that application, minimum how much is required, at least minimum. Suppose this application requires minimum 256. If I set something like this 64 minimum, and maximum also, let's say 128 I have set, but this application is require minimum, let's say 256 memory. If I say limit as 128, first of all, will your application will be able to come up? Minimum this is required maybe 256. If I set this limit to 128, does this container will be come up? No. So how can I decide this number? How can we decide this number? By doing lot of testing, right? You just start with some number, then your testing team, there will be a testing team, different teams like performance testing, stress testing. If the testing team is doing lot of performance testing, stress testing, if your containers are not able to support that much load, your containers are crashing, it is going out of limits, then by doing a lot of testing, lot of performance testing, stress testing, can I come to a conclusion to some number? If performance team is doing some testing, they are doing lot of load, they are increasing lot of load. If our containers are not able to support that much load, can I come to some conclusion like how much limit I can set? Your application team, your development team, and testing team can work together. The application team, the development team, and testing team one can work together to do testing, lot of testing. Then we can come to a conclusion on this number in real time. Okay. Now we are going to set something like this: resource request and limits. Now, even though there is a lot of load, will it able to go beyond this much memory on this container, on this application? If there is a lot of load, will it able to go beyond this much memory? No, no. Now, I'm just creating a deployment. But what is the additional properties I'm adding here, guys? You know already what is deployment. What is deployment? What additional properties I'm adding for my deployment? I mean to say for my pod, we are just setting the resource. We are just setting the resource requests and limits. Resource request and limits. Now, if I directly create a pod also, I'm not creating a deployment. I'm creating a pod directly. Can I have this resource request and limits for pod instead of deployment I am creating? If you see, the resources is defined where exactly? Is the resources are defined under containers for your container? So if I directly create a pod, or whether I'm creating a replica set, whether I'm creating a daemon set, whether I'm creating a stateful set, or whether I'm creating a RS, can I set the resource request and limits? Whether I'm creating a pod, whether I'm creating a deployment? Yes. Now I'm setting like this. This is only something new here. If I just create a deployment and if I deploy, if there is a lot of load, will the scaling will happen automatically, guys? I'm just setting the resource request and limits. Does it mean will it increase and decrease the number of pods automatically if I just set the resource request and limits? If I just set the resource request and limits, nothing will happen. It is not going to scale. So we need one more property, one more Kubernetes object for doing the auto scaling. What is that object? What is the other object which needs to be created so that it can see, it can observe this deployment pods, CPU and memory utilization. Based on that, it will increase and decrease. What is the one more object we need to create? That HPA. HPA. This HPA, horizontal pod autoscaler. That horizontal pod autoscaler needs to be created. Who is going to look after your pods? What is the current load? What is the load? When I can increase, when I can decrease? Do we need someone to look after your pods? Do we need someone to look after your pods? Right? Otherwise, no one will scale. So we are going to have a HPA, one more Kubernetes object like this. One more Kubernetes object like this. HPA. HPA is again what? Again, it's a Kubernetes resource, horizontal pod autoscaler. So what this horizontal pod autoscaler will do, as I already told, this horizontal pod autoscaler will automatically scale the number of, it will scale the number of pods. It will scale the number of pods of any replication controller, deployment, replica set on observed CPU and memory utilization. So if I just create a deployment and I don't create a HPA, anyone is going to observe what is the current load, whether I need to scale, whether I don't, no need to scale. If I just create a deployment, if I don't create this, Does anyone is going to observe when to scale and how to scale? No. Let me relate this to AWS. In AWS, if I just create an auto scaling group, will the nodes will be increased and decreased? In AWS, let's relate this to AWS. If I just create an auto scaling group in AWS, will the number of servers will be increased and decreased? No, right? Do we need to have some scaling policies defined? Do we need to have some scaling policies defined? When to scale and how to scale? Yes. Similarly here, if I just create a deployment like this, will it be increased and decreased automatically based on the load? No. We need to have some kind of a scaling policies. So that is what this horizontal pod autoscaler. That is what this horizontal pod autoscaler. So here I am creating a horizontal pod autoscaler. If you see, minimum replicas I am saying as 2, which means at any point of time, how many pods will be there? Minimum. At any point of time, how many minimum pods will be there? 2 pods. Maximum it can scale to how many pods? I have given here as 5. If I say as 10, maximum how many pods it can scale? Up to how many pods it can scale? 10, right? Now, when it will scale? How it will scale? When it will scale? How it will scale? Where that information has been defined for this HPA, horizontal pod autoscaler? Where that has been defined? If you see, did I define under this metrics section? Under this metrics section, did I set the threshold when the average is this much or this much? If you see here, I am setting the threshold value. The resource is CPU, average utilization is 40, which means the moment the CPU utilization reaches 40, is it going to scale the pod? As of now, let's say you have 2 pods. The moment it reaches average to 40, is it going to increase third pod? Yes. Now, I just gave 40 because I cannot put that much load. That's why I have gave 40. But in most of the cases, the default value is 50. Most of the cases, you will tolerate up to 80. In most of the cases, you will tolerate up to 80. The moment it reaches 80%, it can scale. But I cannot put that much load. That's why I kept 40. So this is on CPU. Can I have it on memory also? Can I have it on memory also? Instead of having just CPU, can I have it on memory also? Based on your requirement, you can have it only on CPU, like this, or you can have it only on memory, or you can have it on both. Whether memory reaches this much percentage, whether CPU reaches this much percentage average, then is it going to increase the third pod, fourth pod like that automatically? Yes. But I have a lot of pods. I have a lot of deployments. So this HPA is for which deployment or which replica set? How I am linking my deployment or my replica set or replication controller to this HPA? If you see, do you have something like this? One object, one property here, scale target reference. Scale target reference. So we are targeting this HPA for what type of Kubernetes resource? We are targeting this HPA for what type of Kubernetes resource deployment. And what is this? I created a deployment with this name. So this HPA is for that deployment. Suppose here if I give as ABC, the deployment name is ABC. Can I have something like this? The scale target reference as ABC. Understand the concept. Don't by heart any values or any comments, right? So I am targeting this deployment. The HPA is trying to target this deployment. We are targeting this deployment. Okay. Now I can define something like this. Now, if I want to access this application within the cluster or outside the cluster, do I need to create a service that you already know? Do I need to create one more object called service if I want to access this application within the cluster or outside the cluster? Yes. Now, I am creating a service. You already know what is service, right? Something like this. If I want to access outside, what type of service needs to be created? So it has to be separated with 3 dashes. We are trying to create a, if I want to access node port service. Now, I've set the limits like this. One more important point. Is this correct, guys? Is this correct? I'm setting request as this much, limits as this much. Is it correct? These type of questions also you will get. Is this correct? Can request will be greater than limits? Can request will be greater than limits? Or request should be less than or equals to limits? Request should be less than or equal to limits. This is fine. This is fine. This is fine. It is not going to give any issue. Suppose if I want to limit this to, what is this small m stands for, guys? When it comes to CPU, this small m stands for millicore. Millicore. So one CPU is equals to 1000 millicores. One CPU is equals to 1000 millicores. So I can give 1/10 of one core CPU. Or if I want to give percentages also I can give. If I give something like this, the request, how much CPU I'm requesting. If I give something like this, half core CPU. Okay. Now let's say I'm requesting one core CPU. The limit can be either same or it can be 2. First of all, now does this part will be scheduled if I request one core CPU? First of all, does your part will be scheduled? Forget about HPA. Does first of all your parts will be scheduled? Does your parts will be created if I request one core CPU as per your resources in the cluster? What is my cluster? Each capacity, my current capacity. What is the capacity of each of my nodes as of now? One CPU, 1 GB RAM, workers. Master machine has 2 CPU, 4 GB. But by default, does parts will be scheduled in the master? This is out of scope. Parts will not be scheduled in the master. But in the workers, I have the server itself has this much capacity. I am requesting this much. Is it going to be scheduled? Is it going to be scheduled if I request one core here? First of all, the server capacity itself is this much. Suppose already some parts is reserved some CPU. Already lot of parts are running, right? You are having Kubernetes related parts like kubeproxy parts, VNet parts. Already those parts requested some CPU and memory. So do you have one CPU completely available for this pod in those nodes? Do you have one core CPU completely available for this pod in that nodes? No. In that case, does parts will be scheduled? Does this parts will be scheduled if I apply? If I apply like this? No. So that is how it works, right? Now let me say 100 millicore. limit also, let's say 100 millicore. I'm saying something like this. Now I'm targeting at average of 40. So the moment it reaches 40%, what is the 40% of 100 millicores? The moment it reaches 40 millicore, can I consider that the threshold? 40% of 100 millicores. Then it will reach the threshold, right? Now it is average. It is average. Average of your pods, not single pod. Let's say now I have set 100 millicore as limit. Let's say this is having 45%. It has reached 45%, and this is having, it is having just 20% reached. Now if I have a HPA, is it going to scale third pod? Suppose currently there are two replicas. Now one pod has reached 45%, another pod is just 20%. Am I going to get a third pod as per this? Am I going to get a third pod as per this? No. It is average of your current replicas. It is going to calculate average of your current replicas. So currently, how many replicas we have for that? Currently, let's say 2. So average of that is basically 45 plus 20 by 2. So what will be the average? 65 by 2, which will become 32 point something. So is it above this threshold? Is it above this threshold, or is it below that threshold? It's below that threshold. So it will not scale. So it is going to take average of your current replicas. It is going to take average of your current replicas. Okay. Is everyone clear how it calculates the threshold? Now let me deploy this one. To demonstrate, let me delete other applications, whatever I have in other namespaces, because I want to show this properly. So let me delete other applications, whatever we have in this namespace. Whatever I have in this namespace. In this namespace, I'm deleting. Delete all, all. Okay. Now let me create this one. That file name can be anything. Since I have not given any namespace, this HPA, this deployment, this service will be created in which namespace? If I apply this now, in which namespace this will be created? Since I have not defined any namespace, under which namespace it has to be created, I have not mentioned any namespace. It will be in default namespace. Now one more thing, sometimes in the interview they may ask this kind of questions. Now if I say deployment as 3 replicas here, replicas as 3 here, okay. Now I'm saying HPA minimum replicas as 2. What will happen? Here I have said the replicas as 3 for my deployment. For this deployment I am creating HPA, but I am saying minimum replicas as 2 now. What will happen? How it works? It is not going to have 6. It is not going to have 6. So the deployment will create 3. The deployment will create 3 replicas, but will it bring down to 2 again? If there is no load, the deployment will create 3, but will it bring down to 2 if there is no load? This HPA, will it bring down to 2 if there is no load? Yes. So when we are using HPA, does it make any sense of using this one? If I am creating a HPA for this deployment, does it make any sense of having this replica here? No. Now, even though I don't give replicas here, I am creating a HPA for the deployment. I am saying like this. So how many it will be created? Even though I don't define, how many it will be created? 2 minimum. But when I will get the third one, when I will get the fourth one, when I will get the fifth one, based on these conditions, based on these utilizations. Now let me show that. Now, if you see, do I have a HPA as of now? Do I have a HPA also as of now? Now, it is going to take some time to reflect. Now, kubectl top pods. What is the current CPU utilization as of now on these pods? Now, if you observe, why here it is showing unknown. What is the mistake? If you see, I created a HPA for this deployment, but is I created a deployment with that name, or deployment name is correct? Did I target this deployment? If you see, right, this is not correct. So let me do this. Either I can update the name of this deployment, or either I can update this reference here. I can update my HPA. So better I'll delete this. So let me update here. Here I have given as ABC, but I am targeting something else. So that is not correct. So HPA is targeted for this deployment. Now I will give that as a deployment name. Let me apply that again, everything. Now I have these pods, right? Now I am targeted to correct deployment, but here it will take some time. The HPA will take some time. What is the current utilization? Let's wait for some time. kubectl top nodes, kubectl top pods. So as of now, it is 9. Now, is it showing? What is this one? What is this one? There are 2. One is CPU, one is memory. So currently, what is the CPU utilization of these pods which belongs to this deployment? What is the CPU utilization as of now? 1. So can I see that average here? What is this below 40? What is this 40? That is our threshold. That is our threshold value. So as of now, what is the utilization? Average utilization? 1. So what is this? 16%. That is based on your memory. Now I have this application, very simple application. Now how can I put the load? How can I demonstrate whether this HPA will work or not? How can I prove that whether this HPA will work or not? So how can I increase the load on this application, these pods? I cannot ask thousands of people to access this application, right? I cannot ask thousands of people to access this application. Can I use some kind of a scripting code, or invoking that application endpoint infinitely? We can use some software, or we can use some application, or I can use a simple shell script. Can I use this curl command on this service? I'm getting some response. Can I have this used, or can I use this invoked infinitely in shell script? Can I make this curl with loop so that the request will be, the load will be increased on that application? I can do that. So before that, let me show you, let me connect to the same control, that kubectl machines, the same machine, so that what is going to happen in the background we can see. Let's watch what is going to happen. Okay. Now let me connect to the same machine where I have a kubectl. So I have a kubectl in this machine installed. Let's connect to the same machine. Here, let me watch kubectl get pods. As of now, how many pods we have? As of now, 2 pods. Here also, let me watch kubectl top pods. Similarly, let me split one more screen there only. No. Sorry, I have to split this horizontally. I need to split. So here also I'll connect to the same machine. I want to show you what is happening. There is no magic in the background. Now let me connect to here. And you watch HPA. You watch HPA. Now if you see, what is the current replicas, minimum pods, maximum pods? What is the current replicas as of now? The current replicas as of now, 2. So what is the current average of CPU? Average of CPU is 1%. Now there is no load. There is no load. Now let me create some temporary pod here. Let me create some temporary pod. So using this service name, will I able to access within the cluster? I'm going to create some temporary pod. I'm going to use this service name. Within the pod, does one application can communicate with other application using service name? This is the service name I have created for that one. If you see, this is the service name. So I am going to create some temporary pod interactively. You create some pod interactively, something like this. What this command does, I'm executing something like this. What this kubectl run? What is this -t or -tty? What is this -t or -tty? We are creating one pod using some image like this. This is one image. From this image, I am creating one pod interactively. What is this option? -rm. Once I come out of that pod, that pod will be deleted. Once I come out of that pod will be deleted. So using this image, I am creating some temporary pod. -tty or -t, interactive. -t or -tty, both are same. So -tty or -t in short form, right? Terminal, interactive terminal. So in the Docker also, can I create a container interactively like this? I want to go inside that shell while creating a container. Have you done this like this? Similarly, I am creating a pod which is going to have one container using this image. I will land inside the container like this. Can I execute commands on a container? I think I already explained, guys. Can I execute some commands like this? Pod name, I want to execute some commands, right? Or if you want to go inside in the existing pod, you can do something like this. If you want to go inside in the existing pod, you can go something like this. SHR bash. Now don't have a pod. What I am trying to do? I am creating a pod and I am going inside that pod interactively. This -rm, once I come out of that pod, that will be deleted automatically. Now, let me create some temporary pod. I got one temporary pod. So from this pod, I will make a request. If you see, do I have a curl? I don't have a curl. Let me use wget. Am I getting the response from this pod? From this pod, I am trying to invoke or access this application using this service, that service name. Am I getting that response when I am using that service name? Now, can I have this in an infinite loop? Can I have this command in an infinite loop so that the load will be increased? Just to demonstrate HPA. So something like this. This is Linux. I think you know what is this. While true, do wget done. It is infinite loop. Unless until I terminate, it will not be stopped. Now I am accessing this one. You observe the load here. The moment we keep on accessing that URL, you observe the CPU utilization here, and also you observe how many parts as of now it is running, and also you observe this one here. Let's see what happens. Now slowly I am increasing the load. So will it run out of either CPU or memory? Now do you see what is the current CPU utilization on both pods? Since I am using service, is service is routing the traffic to both pods or all the traffic is going to single pod? Is it routing the traffic to both pods? Now do you see already, since it goes beyond that target, do you see one pod is getting created here? They created this pod manually. 64 plus 40 by 2, it reaches. Who created this pod, guys? One more pod I got 22 seconds ago. How come this pod has been created? Who executed that scale command? HPA. HPA has executed scale command. Now can I see the current replicas as 3 here? Can I see the current replicas as 3 here? HPA under replica section. Now, is load has been distributed now? If you see, we have total 3 pods. Load has been distributed. Now, Total we have 3. Now, is it under our threshold? Is it under our threshold now? 40% is threshold. Current average is what? 37. So if it go, if it doesn't go beyond that one, am I going to get a fourth pod or fifth pod now? If it doesn't go beyond this much now, am I going to get a fourth pod or fifth pod now? No, I'm not going to get, right? One more question. What if cluster itself doesn't have that much CPU, that much memory? Now we are programmatically the scaling is happening, but what if the cluster itself doesn't have this much memory, this much CPU available to schedule fourth pod or fifth pod? Suppose this much memory, this much CPU is not available in the cluster in any node. In that case, what happens? Even though scale happens, does pod will be scheduled? Even though it will scale, does pod will be scheduled? Does pod will be into running state? No. So we can scale. This pod auto scaler is scaling what? It is scaling the pods in a given resources, in a given infrastructure. If your infrastructure itself doesn't have enough CPU and enough memory, does pod auto scaler will add additional nodes? Is it going to create a one more node in the cluster? Does node will be added to this cluster? Does pod auto scaler does that? No. Pod auto scaler doesn't handle that. But if I go for a managed Kubernetes clusters like EKS, if I go for a managed Kubernetes clusters like EKS, AKS, there is one more concept called cluster autoscaler. If I go for a EKS managed Kubernetes cluster, if I go for a AKS or GKE, there is one more concept called cluster autoscaler. This cluster autoscaler can scale nodes, itself, can scale nodes in a managed Kubernetes clusters, So this cluster autoscaler will act as a bridge between Kubernetes and your cloud. In Kubernetes, between your Kubernetes and the cloud provider, it will act as a bridge. So this cluster autoscaler will talk to the cloud, will talk to the AWS, and it will increase and decrease the nodes, servers. So if I go for a managed Kubernetes clusters, the way we have a pod autoscaler, can I have a cluster autoscaler, which means can I increase the nodes and decrease the nodes whenever your cluster is running out of resources? The nodes, servers itself. Yes. So I will demonstrate this cluster autoscaler also when I go for an EKS so that you can understand. Sometimes in the interview they'll ask this question: what is difference between pod autoscaler and cluster autoscaler? What is difference between pod autoscaler and cluster autoscaler? Pod autoscaler can just scale the pods in a given infrastructure. Cluster autoscaler can scale the cluster also. But can I have a cluster autoscaler in a self-managed Kubernetes clusters? Like whatever clusters I have demonstrated, KubeDM clusters self-managed? No. But pod autoscaler, can I use pod autoscaler in any cluster, whether it's a self-managed or managed cluster? Yes. Now, if required, now I am not going to get a fourth pod because it is under average. So I am not going to get a fourth pod. Now let me stop. Let me come out of this pod. But after some time, if there is no load, if there is no load, does it still maintain 3 pods or it will scale down? it will scale down to 2 pods after some time. After some grace period, if there is no load, will it continue to maintain this current replicas 3, or it will come down to 2? It will come down to 2 pods after some time. Okay. Now, can I use this cluster autoscaler concept for any other deployment? Suppose I am trying to have this Java web application. Can I have this cluster autoscaler for this application also, our own application? Can I have the cluster autoscaler for our own application also? Something like this. So here I can define resources, requests, and limits. Request and limits, right? So based on your requirement, let's say I'm trying to set 200 millicore memory. Guys, it requires some memory. Don't give very less. Let's say I'm requesting 256 minimum. Limits based on your requirement. Let's say 100 millicore memory. Let's say 512, something like this. Now, can I have a HPA also for this application? Can I create that HPA also? Horizontal pod autoscaler. Can I have that? This one for other application. Can I target this deployment? And it should be in the same namespace where your application is getting deployed. Something like this. Now, if I want to target on 80 or 80, something like this. So if I deploy this one, does this parts also will be scaled up, scaled down? This application parts also will be scaled up, scaled down based on the given HPA targets like this. Concept is important, right? Can I deploy this one also like this? Does my Java parts also will be scaled up, scaled down based on the load, based on the given utilization? Because I'm creating a HPA, I'm creating a HPA for that deployment also. I'm targeting that. So this HPA will look after this horizontal pod autoscaler will look after these pods. Okay? This is how it works. Now, as I already told, first of all, if I request something like this, does my parts will be scheduled now, guys? Does my parts will be scheduled now? Does my parts will be scheduled now? Now let's say I'm trying to apply this. So there is some error. API version has been not set. For which one API version? Okay. Here A is missing. A is missing. Now if you see, I deployed in this namespace. Why they are in pending state? First of all, why parts itself is not created? Why they are in pending state? why they are in pending state? How can I see why they are in pending state? How can I troubleshoot? These kind of issues only will get in real time. How can I troubleshoot? Can I describe my pod? Can I describe my pod and see why? What is the problem? What can you understand by this? Scheduling is failed. Scheduler is not able to find any node for this pod. What it is trying to say? 0 by 3 nodes are available. One node has a taint, master node has a taint that pod doesn't tolerate. 2, insufficient CPU. Why it is insufficient CPU? How much I am requesting for that one? How much CPU I am requesting? 1. Do I have any node which has one CPU available completely for this pod? No. That's why it is in a pending state. Now, let me update. I don't want this much for now, let's say. I'll say maybe 0.5, something like this, 200 millicore, something like this. Half core. 0.5 is nothing but half core. It can be either 500 M. Now let me reapply this. Now, at least, is it scheduled now? Is it running now? At least, is it scheduled now? Yes. But if I try to scale, if I try to scale, if I don't have enough nodes, whether I manually scale, whether the HPA will scale, if I try to scale, if I don't have that much CPU memory available in my cluster, the pods will be coming to the running state, the third pod or fourth pod, will it coming into the running state? If each pod I am requesting this much, each pod I am requesting maybe 200 millicore. If I don't have that much CPU memory available, the pods will be coming into the running state, whether it is a HPA scaled or manual scaled? No. But is any node will be added automatically since it's a manual self-managed Kubernetes cluster? Does any node will be added automatically if some parts are in pending state? No. But if I go for a managed Kubernetes cluster, if I have a cluster autoscaler also in my cluster, is it going to scale the nodes also? If some parts are in pending state, if parts are in pending state because of insufficient CPU and memory, if I have a cluster autoscaler, it will create a nodes so that the parts get scheduled in that node. So in real time, if I am going for managed clusters, we are going to have a pod autoscaler to scale the pods. We have a cluster autoscaler to scale the cluster in real time. If you go for a managed clusters, but if you go for a self-managed, can I use this cluster autoscaler concept there? No, only pod autoscaler. Is everyone clear, guys? What is pod autoscaler? What is cluster autoscaler? Very advanced topics. I am trying to cover in and out of what we are doing in my project in Kubernetes, how we are, what and all things we are using in Kubernetes. Okay. I'll explain this cluster autoscaler when I go for an EKS. Okay. Thank you, guys. That's it for today. Tomorrow, I will start with values in Kubernetes, how to use values. Is everyone clear what is pod autoscaler? Is anyone has any queries? Feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll continue tomorrow with values. Okay. Thank you, guys. I'll continue tomorrow. Try to practice whatever has been discussed. Suppose if we have a 30 deployments, for each deployment we need to have a HPA. Yes, correct. HPA is for each deployment, or if you are not using deployment, if you are creating a replica set, each replica set, for each deployment or for each replica set or for each replication controller, you can create a HPA. It is not single HPA for all your applications. For each application, you are going to have a HPA. The way you have a deployment, similarly, you are going to have a HPA. Okay, guys, thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.